And now, you're tuned in to RBLR, the home of Tampa Bay's Reveler Sports.
Hello and welcome everybody to the RBLR podcast, specifically coming to you live in the RBLR Rowdies feed. My name is Leo Santos and I'm always joined by my amazing co-host, James. James, how are you doing today, man?
I am doing well. There is, there's a bunch of stuff in the sports world, I guess, that we got to take into consideration. But personally, I'm doing quite all right. It was a good Gasparilla weekend for me, and I hope you had a good Gasparilla too, if you got to partake in it.
I didn't partake in it, but I did have a good weekend overall. I'm gonna spend some family time, so can never go wrong with that. Speaking of sports, I can't wait to hear that RBLR Bucks whenever an episode comes out about Tom Brady's retirement, his supposed retirement, right?
Right. Yeah.
With mixed news coming out, so hopefully we'll be on the lookout for that. But in regards to this show specifically, we're talking about the Rowdies here. And for those of you who missed out on a couple past episodes, we did do a part one of our old NASL 2 weeks ago, and our most recent podcast was about the CONCACAF World Cup qualifiers. I talked about Mexico, and James and Ben, who you may know him from the RBLR Rays section, they both talked about the U.S. men's national team. And an update on that, the U.S. did win its first game, but then lost to Canada. And then for Mexico, they won their first game and then drew to Costa Rica. Overall, James, how would you rate the U.S. First two games in this qualifying window?
I got to be honest. I thought the first one was obviously much better, but I think that goes without saying. I think personally, I'm not too worried after the Canada loss. You gotta, it's just the case now. The Canadian women's team just won the Olympics, and it seems like the Canadian men's team are, kind of trying to chase their heels. They want to be a top dog country in the sports world, or on the soccer world on the men's side too. And I think that they actually have the tools to do it. So, yeah, like I said, I just can't be too worried about this. The U.S. need to go and win their game against Honduras on Wednesday, which I think everybody should watch. But other than that, yeah, I'm not too worried where we are. What about you?
As far as Mexico, I was happy to see that comeback win against Jamaica, and I thought if we could, go away and come back 1-0 down and score 2 goals in the last 10 minutes, we should beat Costa Rica. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Lots of missed chances, nothing really dangerous from Mexico, and I was just hoping this would be the time where we see the team click. I think I'm going to wait a little bit longer on that, in my opinion. But with all that being said, we do have some Rowdies news here. Not any transfer-related news, but more preseason-related news. The team did begin its preseason training today. There's pics on social media. I forget which players there are, but if you look at them, you'll get those feelings of how close we are for the season to begin and how excited we are for it to begin as well. And on that note, there will be 3 Rowdies games that will be shown live on ESPN2. Usually they're shown on ESPN Plus, but this time, for those who aren't subscribed to ESPN Plus, they'll get to watch the Rowdies 3 times on ESPN2. Will be games against Birmingham City, who we play away on March 13th. And then after that, we'll be against Phoenix Rising in May. That will be another away game. And then in September, we'll play El Paso. That will be home. And again, all these games will be shown on ESPN2. And with all that being said, James, why don't you tell us people what this episode will be about?
Yeah, so one thing you mentioned, we already did this is part 2 of our history series. The first one was on the old NASL. And again, that was 2 weeks ago. So if you haven't, check it out. It goes along with this one. But we are doing the second part of our history series, and this will be specifically related to the Old Rowdies team. So we have an interview coming up here with the great Ian Penderleaf. Ian is a soccer writer and a historian. He has been published not only in Soccer America, but he also has his own book out. He previously wrote Rock and Roll Soccer, The Short Life and Fast Times of the North American Soccer League, hence our interview. And he has written The Quiet Fan and For Whom the Ball Rolls. So with all that in mind, we thought we would do a history series, and that is why I covered the old NASL, and this week we'll be doing the Old Rowdies. And we're going to jump into that. But beforehand, I just want to say, please follow RBLR Sports on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. You can also like and subscribe to our podcast on all major podcast platforms. We obviously appreciate when you do that. but we might as well just get into it because there's quite a bit to cover. The Old Rowdies are, they are the reason that we have a team today in Tampa Bay called the Rowdies. And there is a rich soccer history in the Tampa Bay area. They are actually one of the better teams from the NASL era for lots of reasons that we're going to get into. But this is the history of that old team. So the original Rowdies were founded in June of 1974. They lasted nearly 30 years, which is not too bad considering what happened to a lot of teams from back then. It was owned at the time by George Strawbridge, who was from the Campbell Soup Company fortune. He married into that, and that's where he got his money. And it was also formed by Bo Rogers. So for these two guys, they came from a background in different areas. George Strawbridge owned the Buffalo Sabres and wanted to put a team in Philly. However, there was an expansion team assigned to Philly, and those were the Philadelphia Atoms. They actually won the championship the year that they were included in an NASL, which was the year before the Rowdies started. Now, their general manager, because he, was with that team, he could take an expansion team and turn them into a championship-winning team. I believe that is how George Strawbridge and Bo Rogers ultimately got in contact. Bo Rogers brought him over to the Tampa Bay area. So there are reports back then, and a lot of the stuff that I'm basing this on are on Google archived articles from old St. Pete Times and Tampa Bay Times papers. So it's very helpful that those were saved. But the Evening Independent at the time was talking to these two guys, George Strawbridge and Bo Rogers. They reported that this was supposed to be more of a hobby purchase than an investment. And if everybody remembers from the old NASL, that was a big problem, was when these guys came in and they were trying to make money. A lot of the times they would do so in a way that actually wasn't beneficial to the team or anything like that. But they have a quote from Bo Rogers at the time: "We are in this for keeps. That's a promise. We are going to stay with it as long as it takes to make it successful." So, I think that it's good to note that we were at least on good terms to start with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. From what you've been saying, James, obviously we pointed out very early that, for a club back then to last nearly 30 years, is obviously, for those of you who haven't listened to our previous episode, that there were people, there were owners who had no clue about soccer, and those are the main reasons why, drove so many clubs to the ground. But now, the fact that the Rowdies still last today, but even lasted long enough back then, I think that's very important to keep in mind as we go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, without them having been so successful and actually a large part of the area back at the time that they were around, we probably wouldn't have anything to go off of today. People actually value the name the Rowdies because it evokes a rich history and not just one that kind of burned quickly and then left us, like maybe the Tampa Bay Mutiny, one might say. But
yeah,
I'm going to try and.
Yeah, can you just imagine what would have happened if the Rowdies did not last, 30 years back then? Like, what if, it could have been another club that only lasted about 5 years and then just melt down and totally got forgotten about? Like, we probably wouldn't be here talking about this team right now.
That's exactly right. I don't think we would. I think that there, have been plenty of iterations of soccer in Tampa, including, two teams that have played in the last decade. And, if I mention that, people are going to think of Tampa Bay Rowdies and, they probably don't know who I'm talking about because VSI Tampa Bay was a team that lasted, I think, for 2 years at the most. And, there was, I don't know who their supporters were, but anyway, they disappeared. And I'm glad that we are not that. But I'm going to try and keep this in a chronological order. So we're going to be jumping around a little bit in the sections that I have set up here. So allow me to do that with the beginning of the years. Obviously, like I said, it was founded in June 1974. And in their first year, 1975, the Rowdies come into the league. They have signed Eddie Firmani as coach, and he was a South African-Italian player. Now, he played in a single game in the year of 1975 as well. So it's kind of interesting, but it should be noted that the Rowdies were extremely successful right off the bat. They ended up winning the Soccer Bowl, which was the old NASL championship, beating Portland Timbers 2-0. So, pretty good in the end. And if you start off with a bang, like winning the whole thing. I think that speaks to what the owners were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. You always want to go hard. Always go hard early, win that. Try to make a name for yourselves early. That way you won't be forgotten, as James and I already talked about. So the fact that you did start off with a bang early, it just leads to, I guess, in a sense, people won't forget about you, and instead people will notice you. And James, you and I both know that, later down the line, we're in 2021 and we still know who this team is.
Exactly. So, that I should mention. We'll get back to this. I wanna save this for later because it's very interesting. But the team was announced in November of 1974. Scotsman Alex Pringle was actually their first player, and he was a big part of the team as they move forward. So the Old Rowdies played their first 10 years at Tampa Bay Stadium. That was the Big Sombrero. They also had an indoor team, which we'll cover a little bit here and there. But so they win in 1975, their first year. And then in 1976, they ended up winning the most points overall in the league table. Unfortunately, though, in the playoffs, they lost to the eventual champions, Toronto Metro Croatia, that wonderfully named team that we had talked about in the old NASL episode 2 weeks ago.
They should bring that name back.
I don't know what I don't know how many people in the Toronto area would still be looking for a Toronto Metro Croatia, because it's a very cosmopolitan city with a lot of big immigrant populations there. So the non-Croatian people in Toronto might be a little upset, but who's to say?
That's a good point. Yeah.
And then no NASL team has won the treble. So, if you think about what the treble would have been back then, I'm assuming that would include, the Soccer Bowl and maybe the Indoor Soccer Bowl, because the NASL was trying to be very, big with that. That was something that they were trying to take away from a rival league at the time. And then, maybe they go and win the U.S. Open Cup. No team did that, but the Rowdies did come close. So they won the Soccer Bowl, like I mentioned. They won the Indoor Soccer Bowl at the same time, which was pretty good, obviously. And then the following season, they also won the points total. So that's something that the Rowdies did, which is kind of cool. And I wanted to bring people's attention to that. That coach that I mentioned, Eddie Firmani, he was named the Coach of the Year in 1976. And everything is kind of looking pretty rosy at the moment. It's all very good and hunky-dory, so to speak. But in 1977, it starts to go a little less well, unfortunately. And then the Rowdies don't seem to meet those same heights for the rest of the time that they existed. In 1977, they got to the first round of the playoffs and they lost to the New York Cosmos. The New York Cosmos happened to be ultimately a big rival team for the Tampa Bay Rowdies, as well as the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, which is a team that I think even more recent fans will definitely remember, because we did play the Fort Lauderdale Strikers back when we were in this latest iteration of the NASL. Unfortunately, that league did not last. Of course, this Rowdies team did move over to the USL Championship, and there's so much moving and going back and forth. It's kind of difficult to keep track of, but I think that some people will be familiar with that name at least.
James, I want to ask you real quick. Like, obviously, we weren't alive at this time, so the fact that the Rowdies, like you said, they started off big, they won the Soccer Bowl, and then they come close to winning a treble, and then they lose a first round of playoffs. This happens like a year after year basis. Do you think it may have been a problem that because they won so early, some players may have lost either the motivation or the fact that, we've won a Soccer Bowl already. We're already big ourselves, so it's okay if we don't, reach those same heights as we did one time.
I don't have anything from what I was reading that would suggest that necessarily the players were lacking in any motivation. What I took it as when I was going through, the records for each individual season that the Rowdies were in the NASL, it seemed like it was the teams who were very big spending who were doing pretty well at the, in the late 70s and in the early 80s. So if you remember from, when we were discussing the New York Cosmos 2 weeks ago, the New York Cosmos went out and got Pelé, and the LA Aztecs went out and they got Johan Cruyff, who then moved to the Washington Diplomats. Then the Aztecs replaced Johan Cruyff with George Best. So I think that it actually just came down to, how much money these teams were willing to spend. And unfortunately, as we know from last week, a lot of that kind of led to their downfall because they're spending
Yeah.
so much that they can't really sustain themselves.
That's a good point. Yeah, I totally forgot about that. Didn't think about that.
Yeah, so that's something to consider, but I think that kind of plays into it as the years go by. 1978 and 1979, they ended up runners-up to those Cosmos and the Whitecaps, respectively. So, actually doing pretty well in the playoffs, but, not getting, again, those trophies that I'm sure everybody was looking for. 1980, they lost in the conference semifinal to San Diego, and then in 1981, they lost to the quarterfinals yet again to the Cosmos, hence our being rivals at the time. In that period, they came under new management with Gordon Yago. He is an Englishman who coached for 4 years with a winning record until 1982. And then after that, we obviously had a new coach take over. But, all of this going on at the same time, you have to consider that there is, like I said, everything that's going on with the other teams and their the money they're spending on these big name players. The Rowdies were still a very popular team, even if they didn't have necessarily names like George Best out there. They were very popular. As I said, they enjoyed higher than average league attendance, even drawing over 20,000 people on average for 4 seasons in a row. So you have to think about the time. That's pretty good. In 1980, in fact, they had 2 games where they drew over 50,000 people, and that was against the California Surf and the New York Cosmos. Those are massive crowds for soccer in 1980s America. I mean, I think that, right now, if there is a team that's drawing 50,000 people in America, everybody's looking at them like, well, how did you even do that? What are your marketing techniques? You got to tell me how you got that many people. And the Rowdies are doing that back in 1980. So it's pretty good stuff,
Yeah, definitely is. If you got people asking, what are you doing right, you can never go wrong in that way,
Yeah. And our old indoor team was actually drawing well at the same time, having one season with an average attendance over 6,000 people for the whole year. And then their yearly record games, the attendances for each of those individual games were also over 6,000. So pretty good attendance on both sides there. Now, as we move forward into the chronology of the team, 1982 and 1983, this is where it really did start to bottom out for the Rowdies. We did not make the playoffs in either of those years. In 1983, we did end up ahead of Team America, if you remember them from our discussion of the NASL. They were in our division, and they actually finished bottom. So good for the Rowdies, but bad for the American national team, I guess. It was not a long-lasted team, and unfortunately, it was not a long-lasted league either, because the 1984 season was the last season in NASL, and the Rowdies finished bottom of their division and no playoffs in that year. So it was an end with a whimper, so to speak, when you get to that point. And not just for the Rowdies, but even for the whole league overall. And that's just not a good sign, unfortunately, for where things were. But it was also, again, probably due to that inflated spending.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you're finishing towards the bottom, you don't even make the playoffs in a league where it's slowly, killing itself, it's never a good sign to see that, obviously, because you need to make the playoffs to get money. But again, even if you make that money, the league will still somehow crash. If you haven't listened to our first part of this 2-part episode, because like I said, James, people were paying players too much, and that drove them to the ground. And if you didn't make the playoffs, that just makes things, twice as hard for the Rowdies. Even though they didn't go out there and make those big money signings, if they don't have the money, then they won't really last.
Yeah. And it should be noted here, those 2 previous owners of the Rowdies, Bo Rogers and George Strawbridge, the people who actually founded the team, they had sold it on. Strawbridge sold the team specifically to Stella Thayer, the president of Tampa Bay Downs, Dick Corbett, who you might know as a USF student, Leo. I don't know if you've seen that name around campus at all.
I think I've seen it at the Corbett Stadium. I think his name is there.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
That is the Corbett Stadium, named after Dick Corbett and his wife, Cornelia. Cornelia actually later took on sole ownership of the whole Rowdies team. So, kind of interesting there. And they do have their own legacy within the soccer area and within the soccer community in Tampa. And Bob Blanchard was the other owner. But go ahead with what you were saying.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking about, how Corbett Stadium got its name. I don't know if you've been to a USF game or into Corbett Stadium, but there's a section where it's like a little stand that says "Thank you, Rowdies," and it's pretty cool how like you just said, how he had an impact in the entire Tampa Bay community in regards to soccer. And we know at the time soccer wasn't really one of the biggest sports, but the fact that it stayed for so long, I think it's just really cool to see. Whenever someone goes to Corbett Stadium, you see how someone who made an impact is literally named has a stadium named after them in a very popular university in Tampa.
Yeah, and there is more to the Corbett's legacy with the Rowdies and with USF, which we're going to talk about once we get to the end of this as well. But I will leave that out for the time being. Now, as we move forward with the Rowdies, even though the NASL was finished, as we mentioned, the Rowdies organization continued to live on under those new owners that I just mentioned. Ultimately, it did go into Cornelia Corbett's hands solely, but the Rowdies still had, games to play. They played one season of outdoor in the AISA, making it to the playoff quarterfinals. That league ultimately did not continue, but Rodney Marsh was managing all through 1983 on, and he actually stayed with the team as the NASL folded. When they did that AISA season, he was there, and then unfortunately there wasn't too much to involve the Rowdies in afterwards. In 1985, they had one outdoor game against the U.S. men's national team. In fact, they drew over 30,000 fans for that. So, a pretty good turnout yet again.
Yeah.
And I think that probably had something to do with the fact that there just weren't that many games going on. If there's one game, then you got to go. I guess most people thought that. But in 1986, they hosted a July 4th 4-game tournament, and they also had 2 extra games against the recently founded Orlando Lions. If you go to 1987, they also played 2 outdoor games against the Orlando Lions, and then they actually get back into a league after this. So the Rowdies played in the American Soccer League in 1988 and 1989, making the playoffs in the 89 season. After that, though, the outdoor team did stop playing. So I want to take this quick second to do a little bit of coverage on the indoor team. Indoor isn't as big in America as it was, I think, back at the time, but it should be noted it was a larger part of the NASL and all the NASL franchises. So I'm going to just make that quick pit stop and say that the indoor team won 3 titles in 1976, in 1979 through 1980, and then again in 1983. So, there is a lot to build off here on both sides of the field. And then the Rowdies did continue up until 1994 with their indoor team. So that was the history of the players and the leagues that they played in. We've obviously got a little bit more to go through here, but what is your takeaway from all that, Leo, with the way that it kind of went for the Rowdies even after the NASL?
Yeah, well, first of all, one of my main takeaways was that like you just said, indoor soccer was a part of a big thing in regards to NASL before they collapsed at the time, and the fact that the Rowdies did get to win titles in there, it was a big deal for them, even if it wasn't outdoor soccer. But again, the fact that even after the league collapsed, they still found ways, not plenty of ways. Like I said, they had an outdoor game against the U.S. men's national team, and 30,000 fans showed up. I thought that was really cool. I think it kind of shows how many fans still back this team, even though they weren't necessarily in the league or anything like that. But my biggest takeaway is that this team, without the big signings of Pelé or really going in the route that other teams did, which will eventually cost them because they basically financially destroyed their own club. But for the Rowdies, to stay alive, to stay relevant, even if they didn't make the playoffs, I think it's really impressive how they come so far from owner to owner to owner, and how they still stay relevant, not only at the time, but also, today. We see now they're back-to-back USO championships. Obviously, one was played, one wasn't. But overall, I think my main takeaway is that it's really impressive to see how this team found a way to stay alive. And honestly, if I was to compare this, I don't really have all the information like as much as you do, James, but if I was to compare this franchise compared to other soccer franchises that were part of NASL, it looked like they were probably the best managed team in regards to ownership.
I think that's a very important takeaway. And, we can compare that even to teams that are in the different leagues that the Rowdies have had to play in the last 10 years. There are teams that aren't around at this point, and, they were larger teams in, let's say, 2015, 2014. There are teams that the Rowdies are playing against in, this upcoming season because they didn't see a future in the league they were in, and they wanted to come over to the USL Championship because they see it as a much more stable place. I think that, the NASL is a testament to how important it is to manage things properly on a financial side in a country where soccer isn't the biggest sport. So, I definitely agree that it's paramount that everybody looks at this. Not, you're not going to make a quick buck. You're probably going to lose money for the first 10 years if you own a team, let's say. But if you can make it to the 10 years after that and the 10 years after that, maybe then you'll start turning over some money. But more so, you got to be interested in actually making it work.
Yeah, that's one thing, making it work. And also, making it work in regards to what can you do to get more fan involvement and also stay relevant, within a time where the NSL was, unfortunately crashing itself down.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're going to get to the legacy of that Old Rowdies team, but I do want to mention some historic players because as much as we didn't have, like I said, the George Best, we didn't have Johan Cruyff, Pelé, some other very big names that were around the league at the time, we definitely did have some important players who were very good. So Chilean Oscar Fabiani, who was actually born in Argentina, he finished the 1979 league as the scoring champion. He had 25 goals and 8 assists, so not too bad. And if you look around, the other scoring levels, South African Derek Smethurst, he finished 1976 as the league goal scoring champion. So not just, points, which included at the time goals and assists, but goal scoring, and he had 20 of those. South African international Steve Wagerly was a big name player for the Rowdies at the time. He was with them for several years, and his brother, who actually turned out to be an American international, Roy Wagerly, he played for the team in that fateful 1984 season. Now, Roy Wagerly actually stuck around and ultimately played for the Mutiny down the line. So that's kind of an interesting little takeaway that I found between the two Wagerly brothers there. 1976, the North American Player of the Year, that was American Arnie Mosser. Arnie Mosser was actually, one of the good American players. We talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about, how American players were often excluded from these rosters and they were only there because they were mandated to be there. Arnie Mosser actually seems to have been a player who earned his position. And, that's pretty cool at the time because there was definitely a lot of competition from people outside of North America. And if you want to build it here, you definitely got to look at the players who are local too. Another South African player was Mike Connell. He is still the NASL consecutive regular season starts record holder. And, you have to consider that the NASL is done, so that record probably won't change. But he had 100, good for him for getting it at the time because he had 179 consecutive regular season starts. And I mean, that speaks to how iron he was as a player to have been able to last that long.
That's really impressive.
Yeah. Those are some big name players, and I don't want to go through just a list of all the great players that are out there, so to speak. But I do want to talk about those couple of players who hit these heights. And that one thing that I should do, and this will be a list, I want to have a couple of Rowdies players who actually played in World Cups over the years. So this would have been back through the 70s and the 80s. And possibly leading into the 90s. But Roy Wagerly and Hugo Perez played for the U.S. men's national team. So those actually, we did have some good American players on this team, as well as the guys that were, the guys that we imported to represent the Rowdies. Arsène Auguste played for Haiti in a World Cup. Adrian Alston played for Australia. There was Argentine Carlos Babington, and we actually even had 3 Brazilians who played for the Rowdies and for the Brazilian national team at a World Cup. And those were Clodoaldo, Lima, and Mirandinha. So, those are some very big players, not just for the Rowdies, but also for their country, obviously, to have made it that high in the game. It's very important that I mention them. And the one last name I want to say, this is a player that a lot of Rowdies fans will be familiar with because he is still very much involved with the team. He is also on a lot of radio shows, and that is Rodney Marsh. He was an English player who came over to play for the Rowdies, and he represented us over a number of years, and also, like I said, was our coach for several years after that. So those are a lot of the players who, they might be up for the most famous Rowdies players from back in that time.
I just want to say real quick about the players that represented their countries in the World Cups that used to play for the Rowdies. it's easy to name these like these countries that don't really have a chance to win the World Cup, but those players. Oh, we did have those players that did play for teams like you said, Argentina and Brazil. These are two big national powerhouses when they compete in World Cup. So I think it's really really cool to see and to know that we did have players in which they did compete in the World Cup, but not only in the World Cup, but with countries that could have potentially won the World Cup those years that they played in.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's definitely the case that, around the 70s and 80s, the Brazilian national team, the Argentinian national team, those were very important. The U.S. men's national team at that point was not even qualifying for World Cups, but definitely Argentina and Brazil were contenders. So yeah, as you said, very important, very talented people. So those are some players I wanted to highlight, and now I will move into a section dedicated to the legacy of the Old Rowdies. And there are a couple of fun little facts here that I wanted to toss out as well. For one thing, the Old Rowdies did have fans. So obviously we have Ralph's Mod and Skyway Casuals now. And these are not necessarily affiliated with the old fans, but at the time, fans who went to the games would call themselves fannies. And, I guess that makes sense. They had both a pep squad and a cheer squad. Now, the cheer squad were called the Wowdies, and the pep squad was called the Loudies. And I think that there are a lot more puns that are probably came about back then that we might not be familiar with. But I like that those things were a part of the culture.
Yeah, I think it's just really fun to hear those names, the Wowdies and the Loudies. It just plays so on with the obviously the term they're referring to as the Rowdies, but that would have been really cool to see.
Yeah. So, where did the Rowdies name come from? Now, the thing that was the basis for everything. This is what I kind of wanted to save to the end of our talk on the Rowdies, because it is a very interesting story. The name was actually chosen from over 12,500 submissions at the time when they announced that there was going to be a team. Winner got tickets for life, and I honestly don't know if this man is still around to take advantage of that or not, but it was Bill Wilhelm, a St. Petersburg native, and he submitted that to them. And like I said, it was announced in the newspaper that he had won with this submission and that the Tampa Bay team was going to be called the Rowdies based off of that. So, I thought that was a weird little fact that they just kind of picked the name not out of a hat, but out of a list of things that people had sent in. And there were all sorts of crazy names that people had sent in, but the Rowdies are the ones that won in the end.
That is actually really interesting because whether this man is still alive to see his team or not, I feel like one of the Rowdies groups, the Ralph's Mod or Skyway Casuals, to try and track down if this person's alive and if he has any kids that live on, to see if those tickets are still provided, or I think it's important to find a guy who created the name for the Rowdies, because everyone knows them as the Rowdies, and it's all thanks to him. So I think it'd be really cool to investigate if this man's still alive or not, and also how is his legacy still being continued in today's world.
Yeah, I would like to do that too, and maybe that will be the subject of another episode. We got to find out what happened to Bill Wilhelm, but yeah, that is just a funny little tidbit that I found while I was going through some research for this episode. But yeah, that was obviously where the Rowdies came from, and then the Wowdies and the Loudies. Now, when the Rowdies ultimately did fold, the Major League Soccer came along after that, and the Tampa Bay Mutiny existed for a couple of years. They lasted in MLS until, unfortunately, they did not. And then in 2010, the Rowdies returned, although at that time they were not called the Rowdies. It was the same colors, but it was FC Tampa Bay. Ultimately, the current ownership, or I shouldn't say the current ownership group, they have since sold, but the ownership group from around 2010 was able to get the rights to the Rowdies name and the colors and everything else. And they have brought it back, I think, around 2013. When we were able to start calling ourselves that again. Now, there are two stars on our crest at the moment, which every Rowdies fan should be aware of. One of them is for the 1975 Soccer Bowl, which I mentioned, and the other is for the 2012 Soccer Bowl, which was also in the NASL, just a different version. And the last thing that I wanted to mention about the Rowdies and their legacy was in relation to the Corbetts. Again, I brought them up. They were one of the people who took over for George Strawbridge as an owner in 1983, and then Cornelia Corbett became the sole owner. So you mentioned that they are the namesake of the USF Stadium, where the Bulls play soccer on the men's and women's side. So the Rowdies Cup is still contested every year between the University of South Florida and the University of Tampa. And this was also founded by the Corbetts, which is a very cool little tidbit. I had seen, that USF and UT play each other every year. It's not really the biggest media event, I should say, at this point, but it's still a very cool thing, and it's especially cool, in my opinion, because it was founded by the Corbetts, who were the Rowdies owners, and tried to help carry that team even past the years that the league that they were founded to play in had itself folded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, James, this isn't really a big eye-catching in regards for like the media or anything like that. But the reason why I said earlier how like Corbett, how the Corbett Stadium was named after someone who made an impact in the Tampa Bay community is because what you still see in today's world, not only in today's game in the Tampa Bay area, specifically at USF, but not only do you see his name, not only do you see "Thank You Rowdies," on a building inside on the little stand inside the stadium, but you also see a little tournament called the Rowdies Cup for USF against UT, and it was founded by the Corbetts, who obviously, like we said several times, that's what the stadium is named after. And like you said, I think it's really cool to see how this little competition, although it's not the biggest competition, it's still really cool to see how there's still an interesting meaning behind it, and how USF and UT still make sure to keep this little cup going on, just to either pay tribute to the Corbetts or just to continue the tradition. And I think it's really cool, and I feel like Rowdies fans, they should look into at least watching one of these games. So I feel like if you know the meaning behind it, it will kind of make it more interesting for themselves. And I think it's just really cool how today we still see the impact that the Corbetts had on Tampa Bay soccer.
And you said, you think it would make it more interesting to understand the history behind it. And that is exactly how I felt, actually, once I learned that. I am, someone who follows soccer at all sorts of different levels, including college soccer at points. And, I have seen, like I said, that there was a Rowdies Cup played by USF and UT. And by I have seen that, I mean, I see it when they announce it in the media after the game is played, usually every year. I don't necessarily have it as a thing on my calendar that like, oh, the Rowdies Cup is coming up. I got to see who comes out on top this time. But maybe in the future, it's something that I'm going to pay a bit more attention to because I actually know what's going on there. And I would like to see, how it turns out for the rest of the year. Maybe USF looks pretty good and they turn into one of the better teams in their division, let's say. Maybe UT actually comes back and wins it. They haven't done that very recently. So for them to do that, I would imagine it would be an indication of how good their team is to, be a D2 team that could be D1 USF. So yeah, I think that I would personally be interested in that. And maybe we could get a little bit more history. It was really interesting going through all of this stuff for this podcast that we're doing now. How many branches I could have tried to climb up in terms of creating even more podcasts episodes down the line, because we're thinking about this branches off into all of this kind of history about these different teams or these different players, and this branches off into this whole tournament that happens every year, and I don't know about it all that well. So yeah, it was very interesting.
It was really interesting, and I like how you made that point of how the more you know of the meaning behind the Rowdies Cup, the more you want to look into, how will USF do this season? How will UT do this season? So I feel like if you know, like we said, the meaning behind it or the history behind it, it will kind of lead you down to more roads of like which teams to support or, which teams to follow. Because at the end of the day, these two schools, USF and UT, they were some way impacted by the Corbetts, who we know were former owners of the Rowdies. So I think it's just really cool to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one final thing that I want to say in relation to the Rowdies, or the Old Rowdies, I should say, their legacy, there are a lot of lessons that this current team can take from not only the franchise that the Rowdies were back then, but also the soccer leagues that they played in. Because they played in the NASL for several years. When that folded, they kept trying to find more competitions, and ultimately, they played in one or two others along the way. They have a lot of experience, or there were a lot of experiences for us to draw from back then. And I think that part of it is definitely money management, because you got to be able to pay your bills in a reasonable way. You have to look at what happened in the NASL in the 1980s, where these teams are spending incredible amounts on player salaries, and they're spending up to 70% of their income on that. And then, the bottom falls out of the economy around 1980 and they go into recession. Suddenly they're making even less money, these owners of the soccer franchises. I think that, if you're an owner of a soccer franchise, because in America, most of them are franchises, you have to keep in mind, unfortunately, because of the system that we have, recessions are going to happen at some point. There was one around the time that this iteration of the Rowdies were founded, and they were able to survive through that. But, what happens if another one comes down the line? You got to make sure that you have not just the money coming in, but obviously you also have the infrastructure to deal with that kind of stuff. And you can't be, you definitely can't be, the Rowdies have had a couple of big name players over the years. I think Joe Cole probably qualifies as the biggest of them for this current iteration. But, we can't have a Joe Cole at every position, let's say. That's not a sustainable way to go and try and win the league.
Yeah, and I think one of the points you made as well was that, for any owners who take over a soccer franchise in the United States, at least, you got to somehow somehow manage a team looking at the big picture, but also looking at it, each single step at the same time. And if you could balance those two things, then for sure, you could be a successful owner, whether it's a USL or, USL League One or whatever it is. You could be successful in managing a soccer franchise. I feel like because of the downfall of the NASL, both most recently about 10 years ago and also back then in the 70s and 80s, I feel like the lessons have been learned from there, and I feel like USL is heading in the right direction. And if there are new teams that come in, I feel like they'll have the ownership that would have their lessons learned as well. And if we're talking specifically about this current Rowdies franchise, I mean, they survived. They had to shut down for a little bit, but then they came back, and now it looks like they're here to stay for a very, very long time. And it's because we go back to the point where, those lessons were learned at the time where, soccer, any owner managing a soccer team were put under a lot of pressure, and it was very hard to manage.
Yeah, I think that we have a front office staff for this Rowdies team that is, very smart about the way that they try to build a team. They have a coach who has, he's done a lot in only a couple of years that he's been coaching, but he actually has a ton of experience. And they go out and they get a lot of big name players within the league that they're in, but they're not getting these players that are such a big name that they're going to blow up the bills. If they demand a salary that's, X amount higher than they're actually able to pay. I think that they are looking for players who are not necessarily even diamonds in the rough, but they are players who are very good value for the money that you're putting out there. And as a sports team in, a lower division, that's ultimately what it takes. And it's also the case that it seems to be a lot of these players that we have are bought into that. And, that makes me feel good about it too, because they're not going to, be upset with the conditions that they're in and, be unhappy out on the field. They're all very bought into it as far as I can see. And I can't speak enough to the front office staff at the Rowdies. And I just hope that the ownership group that is in charge right now, I hope that they keep all of those people in place and make sure that they are allowed to do what they have been doing.
Quickly, I'll say this, James, and then you can move on to our next segment. But I feel like what we have with the front office staff for the Rowdies is something that you wish is that not something that you wish, but something that you want every other team in the USL to have. Because although when we play against other teams in USL, obviously we hate them because we want to beat them, right? But at the same time, we hope they have the same kind of culture and environment of a front office that we have also apply at other teams. and also in their ownership as well, because you want to see these teams last. You know, because we talk about the history and how easy it was for teams to collapse. You want to see these teams last so the USL continues to grow, and also teams get better the longer they're more relevant, the longer they stay in the league because they learn lessons. They can show other players that they want to sign that, like, look, we've been in this league for a while, we know how it works, and you're a piece to our puzzle that we can complete to compete in this league. So I feel like if other teams can operate the same way that the Rowdies have, or learn lessons that won't really crash them down to the ground or ruin their franchise, I feel like that'd be really good for those teams and also for the league overall.
Yeah, there's a ton that we could take away, and we could spend. I mean, we could probably spend another 2 or 3 podcasts just going over all of that kind of stuff. But we don't want to take up too much of the listeners' time with doom and gloom speak either, because I think that everything is in a very good place right now. And barring some catastrophe, not only with the Rowdies but with the league, I think that it's a very good outlook overall for both organizations, and I think that we're in a good spot. But that will do it now for our 2-part history series on the old NASL and the old Rowdies. And please, everyone, if you like this, we are looking to make sure that we have a whole off season's worth of content before we actually get into the season coming up. We've got ideas for what we're going to do, but maybe there are some topics that you would like us to cover in this off season. And if you have any of those, you can tweet at us, or maybe this is something you enjoyed. I don't know how many people have gotten into this history series yet, and how many people might or might not have enjoyed it. So hopefully we'll get some feedback there as well. But let us know if you want us to cover anything in particular in the meantime. Another thing we do want to say, please, if you can, we do want you to like and subscribe. That is free, obviously. But if you think that maybe you might need some new clothes for this year, it was cold for quite a
really
couple
cold
weeks now. But I think it's going to be warming up supposedly later this week, and maybe because we live in Florida, it's just going to keep getting warm. But if you need any new clothes out there, you can support this podcast by heading over to shop.rblrsports.com and checking out all of the new designs that we have lined up there. There is a link in the description for that shop, and you can use the promo code COYR for 10% off, and discounts are obviously always great. The last thing that I want to say is we will have a link to the quote unquote official site of the Old Rowdies in our description. You can peruse that if you'd like, and it's another place that you can get a lot of the information that I went over today, and you can probably get it in a lot more detail. Like part 1 of this series about the NASL, I did not want to go into a ton of detail. I wanted to make it not bare bones, but give you an outline of how things were at the time and what things were looking like, not only for the league, but the team and the players, and what the basics of the structure around them was. There's a lot more detail that I left out for sure. But there's a ton of information on that. And like I said, you will be able to check out the site. It's going to be in our description. But that's going to do it for us tonight. So listeners, thank you for tuning in. And Leo, thank you for being a soundboard that I can, do this history podcast with. I think that you and I have a pretty good setup here for any future ones.
Definitely. Yeah. Either one of us is either going to learn and ask questions, and the other one's going to have all the information. As long as it continues to work that way, we could have unlimited episodes of this kind of format.
Yeah, we got a lot to go, and I'm sure there's a lot more that we will find to cover. But like I said, for everyone tuning in tonight, that's all we're going to be doing for this evening. Please, if you can, follow RBLR Sports on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We are at RBLR Sports there. You can also follow me if you'd like. I am mostly on Twitter at this point, and I am at RBLR James K. Leo, where could they find you if they would like to get at you?
You could find me on Twitter at I'm Leo Santos _. And like James said, don't feel free to interact with us, ask us questions, or ask the RBLR Sports podcast questions. You can do that by plugging in the hashtag #AskRBLR, and we'll be sure to get to your questions. And that applies not only for the Rowdy section, but any other section that we cover for this podcast. That includes the Bucks, the Lightning, and the Rays as well. So just be sure to send in your questions. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We're available on Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Apple and Google Podcasts, YouTube, and all other major podcast platforms. And once again, we thank y'all for listening to our two-part series of covering the history of the NASL and also the history of the Rowdies. James, you did an amazing job on that. But with all that being said, I think there's only one thing left to say. Come on, you Rowdies, and let's go, Rowdies.
Come on, you Rowdies.
Thank you for tuning into this presentation by RBLR Sports. On your way out of the stadium, please remember to like and subscribe.